The quiet hum of a sleepy afternoon drifted over the town square, where Harold Gray sat by the old chessboard, each piece meticulously arranged. His hands, steady yet marked with the wear of age, rested on his cane as he surveyed the empty board. Harold was a fixture here, steady, thoughtful, and a man of few words. People watched him, sensing something in the way he observed life around him. Today, though, was different. A young man, maybe in his 20s, approached with a confident stride, his eyes fixed on Harold. Dressed in casual clothes but with an unmistakable air of bravado, he sized up the older man. "Hey, old-timer," the young man, Ethan Ward, said with a smirk. "Mind if I take a seat?" Without waiting for an answer, he plopped down across from Harold, setting his bag on the ground. Harold simply nodded, meeting Ethan's gaze with calm curiosity. "You play?" "Do I play?" Ethan chuckled, leaning back. "I practically live for this game." He began setting up the pieces, his movements quick and precise. "Used to be the best in my college chess club. I've got a few trophies under my belt." Harold merely raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Well, sounds like I'll have my work cut out for me." Ethan scoffed. "Don't worry, I'll go easy on you." As the pieces were arranged, the quiet tension thickened. The young man's arrogance was as clear as his overconfident smile, but Harold remained calm, his expression unreadable. "White goes first," Harold said, motioning to Ethan. With a smirk, Ethan made an aggressive opening move. Harold watched the board, his fingers resting gently on the bishop, considering his options. "What's the matter?" Ethan taunted. "Lost already?" But Harold's gaze didn't waver. Instead, he shifted a single piece, his face as calm as ever. "Patience, son. It's a game of patience." Ethan rolled his eyes but took the bait, eager to press forward with more bold moves. As he made his next move, Harold nodded thoughtfully, countering Ethan's aggression with slow, deliberate moves. Despite Ethan's efforts to speed things along, Harold remained calm, steadily drawing him into a complex game that wasn't as easy as it first appeared. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the intensity at the chessboard. They watched the young man's confident smirk gradually give way to a look of mild concern. Harold's steady hand and calm focus contrasted starkly with Ethan's increasingly erratic moves. Ethan leaned forward, trying to decipher Harold's strategy. "You play often?" "Enough," Harold replied softly, his fingers hovering over a knight. His tone held a hint of mystery, as though he were speaking more to himself than to Ethan. With a gentle motion, he moved his knight into place, strategically blocking one of Ethan's best moves. Ethan's face fell, and the crowd murmured. His attempt to dominate was slipping through his fingers, and Harold's expression gave away nothing. The tension thickened, and a few whispered to each other, wondering who this old man really was. "Not bad," Ethan muttered, trying to keep his cool. "I've faced worse." Harold only smiled faintly, his eyes on the board. "Have you?" he asked, his tone soft yet probing. It was a simple question, but something about the way he asked it struck Ethan deeper than he expected. And in that moment, with the board lying between them, Ethan felt a strange, unsettling feeling. It was as if he were playing against someone who understood more than just chess strategies, someone who had experienced life in ways he could only imagine. The game continued in silence, each move adding a layer to the silent conversation unfolding across the chessboard. Ethan had come here to show off, to prove himself, but Harold's calm and collected demeanor began to make him doubt. "What did you do before this?" Ethan asked, unable to mask his curiosity any longer. Harold's gaze shifted from the board to Ethan, his eyes thoughtful. "Many things," he said softly. "Things that teach you to keep your head, to see beyond what's in front of you." A hush fell over the crowd as Harold moved his rook, a move so subtle yet decisive that Ethan's jaw clenched in frustration. And that's when Ethan realized that this wasn't just a game. It was something more. The tension around the chessboard was thick, punctuated only by the occasional murmur from the onlookers who had gathered to watch. Ethan leaned in, eyes narrowed. His confidence dimmed, but his competitive spirit reignited. He was determined not to let some old-timer teach him a lesson, Not on the board, and certainly not in front of a crowd. "So, you think patience is the way to win, huh?" Ethan muttered, his fingers tapping restlessly on the edge of the table. He moved a bishop forward, hoping to set a trap. It was an aggressive move, and his smile returned slightly, anticipating the veteran's next move. Harold, however, was unfazed. He simply glanced down at the board, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Sometimes," he replied, his tone as steady as ever. "And sometimes, it's about knowing which battles aren't worth fighting." The cryptic answer didn't sit well with Ethan. He was used to directness, strategy that was clear and structured. But Harold's approach seemed vague, fluid. Every move he made looked simple, but effectively countered Ethan's every attempt at control. As the game continued, Ethan felt himself getting drawn deeper into Harold's rhythm, struggling to keep up with the unexpected complexity. The crowd was murmuring, sensing the tension between the two players. The onlookers seemed as curious about Harold as Ethan was, and every small, deliberate move Harold made left them wondering who he really was. They whispered among themselves, noting the faint glimmer of confidence in his otherwise calm demeanor. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You play like you've done this a million times," he said, frustration seeping through his words. "You must have had a lot of free time." Harold looked up, his eyes meeting Ethan's with a quiet intensity. "Not as much as you'd think," he replied. "Life's different when you're dealing with real stakes. When every move matters." The words carried a weight that hung in the air, thick with implication. Ethan paused, thrown off guard by the statement. He moved a pawn forward, realizing too late that he'd opened himself to an unexpected counter. Harold made his next move with such precision that Ethan felt his confidence slip even further. For all his skill, Ethan was starting to see a different side of the game, one that required a patience and foresight he hadn't anticipated. And despite himself, he felt a spark of respect for the man across the table. "Ever lose?" Ethan asked, feigning a casual tone as he tried to cover his frustration. Harold's eyes softened. "Depends on what you consider losing." It was an answer Ethan didn't understand, and he didn't like feeling like he was missing something important. In an attempt to regain his edge, he forced himself to move faster, pressing Harold with more aggressive plays. The crowd around them seemed captivated, and the intensity of the game grew. But Harold didn't speed up. His movements stayed calm, calculated. He countered Ethan's moves with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime waiting, watching, and anticipating. "Where'd you learn to play like this?" Ethan finally asked, his tone tinged with both irritation and genuine curiosity. Harold didn't look up this time. His eyes were on the board, tracing each possible move. "In places you'd never expect," he answered, his voice carrying a hint of something Ethan couldn't quite name, a sense of loss, or maybe just experience. The answer hung between them as Harold made another decisive move, effectively cutting off Ethan's knight. Ethan clenched his fists, feeling his plans fall apart once again. The crowd leaned in, eager to see what would happen next, and Ethan could feel the weight of their anticipation pressing down on him. A part of him wanted to throw in the towel, to escape this unnerving confrontation. But his pride wouldn't let him. He moved a pawn forward, trying one last desperate gambit. Harold's next move was a checkmate. The silence was immediate. The crowd stared, a few gasping in disbelief, others chuckling in quiet admiration for Harold's unexpected skill. Ethan stared at the board, his face flushed, his fingers still hovering over his last useless move. Harold looked up, his eyes meeting Ethan's with a steady gaze. "It's not just about winning," he said, his voice low but firm. "Sometimes it's about understanding what you're up against. And sometimes—" He paused, a flicker of something unspoken passing across his face. "It's about learning who you are in the process." Ethan said nothing, feeling a strange mix of embarrassment, respect, and curiosity. Harold wasn't just an opponent. He was something else entirely. Ethan realized he wanted to know more, to understand who this man was and what his past held. As the crowd began to disperse, Harold packed up the board and stood, giving Ethan a small nod. "I'll be here tomorrow," he said simply, "if you're interested in another game." Without waiting for a response, Harold turned and walked away, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts, his questions, and the unsettling feeling that he'd just encountered something far greater than a simple game of chess. The next day, Ethan returned to the town square, his mind buzzing with questions about the man he'd faced. He spotted Harold at the same bench, setting up the chessboard with careful precision. The older man's presence was like a quiet force, steady and unwavering, yet somehow carrying an intensity that Ethan couldn't shake. As he approached, Harold looked up with a faint smile, nodding to the empty chair across from him. "Back for another game?" Ethan smirked, though it was more cautious than the day before. "I wasn't planning on letting an old-timer show me up again." Harold chuckled softly, beginning to arrange his pieces. "Good, because there's more than one way to win a game." They began, Ethan opening with an aggressive move as usual, but this time he was watching Harold closely, trying to read the man behind the board. The game progressed, and despite Ethan's best efforts, Harold stayed one step ahead, countering each move with a calmness that left Ethan struggling to keep his composure. Finally, curiosity got the better of him. "You said something yesterday," Ethan ventured, his eyes on the board but his mind racing. "About learning who you are in the process. What did you mean by that?" Harold paused, fingers resting lightly on a knight, and for a moment he looked like he was somewhere else entirely. "I meant that sometimes it's not the game that matters, it's what the game reveals about the person playing it." The answer was vague, yet it hinted at something deeper, something Ethan didn't understand. But he wanted to. "Were you in the military?" Ethan asked suddenly, catching a flicker of something in Harold's expression. Harold nodded slowly, a hint of a shadow passing over his face. "A long time ago. The kind of work that changes a person, makes them see things differently." "Like what?" Ethan pressed, sensing a story waiting to be told. Harold's eyes lifted, meeting Ethan's with a gaze that seemed to look straight through him. "Like what matters, and what doesn't." His voice was soft, yet his words had weight, an unspoken history carried in each syllable. Ethan shifted, feeling that weight, and glanced at the board. He noticed for the first time that Harold's moves were more than just tactical. They were layered, almost deliberate in how they guided the game, pushing Ethan into positions where he was forced to reconsider his choices. Each time Ethan thought he was closing in on victory, Harold redirected him, quietly, subtly, until Ethan was back at square one. "Are you teaching me a lesson?" Ethan asked, half joking but half expecting Harold to say yes. Harold smiled, moving his bishop and capturing Ethan's rook with surprising swiftness. "The best lessons are the ones you discover on your own," he replied. Ethan paused, studying the board and feeling more lost than he had at the beginning. "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to discover here, honestly." Harold leaned back, giving him a long, thoughtful look. "Tell me, why do you play this game?" Ethan blinked, surprised by the question. "I don't know. I like winning, I guess, proving I'm better than my opponent." Harold nodded, as if he expected that answer. "But there's more to chess than just winning, isn't there?" Ethan shrugged, unsure how to respond. "Think about it," Harold continued, his voice calm and steady. "Chess isn't just about taking pieces, it's about understanding. The best players see more than just the moves. They see the person they're playing against." Ethan frowned, studying the board as if the answers might be hidden there. He'd always played to win, always focused on getting the upper hand, but for the first time he wondered if he'd missed something important. They continued in silence, Ethan lost in thought and Harold's calm gaze never leaving the board. As they played, Harold's words lingered, and Ethan found himself reevaluating each move he made, wondering what it revealed about himself. It was unsettling, as if he were seeing the game, and himself, for the first time. As the game neared its end, Ethan felt himself growing increasingly frustrated, yet he also felt strangely at peace. Harold's calmness was contagious, and for once Ethan wasn't as focused on winning as he was on understanding. Understanding why Harold played the way he did, why he seemed so at ease with every move. When the game ended, with Harold winning yet again, Ethan didn't feel defeated. he felt curious. "Same time tomorrow?" Harold asked, packing up the board. Ethan nodded, the questions burning in his mind. "Yeah, I'll be here." And as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something much bigger than a chess game, something that would change him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Ethan arrived at the square the following day, feeling more unsettled than usual. He hadn't been able to shake the conversation he'd had with Harold. The older man's words, the way he hinted at things that lay beneath the surface, had stirred something in Ethan he couldn't quite explain. Harold was already there, setting up the chess pieces with his usual precision. Ethan took his seat, nodding to Harold, who gave him a warm smile in return. "Good to see you, Ethan. Ready for another game?" Ethan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The questions that had been simmering finally boiled over, and before he could stop himself, he asked, "Harold, you said yesterday that you were in the military. What kind of work did you do?" Harold paused, his hand hovering over a pawn. His gaze grew distant, and for a moment Ethan wondered if he'd overstepped. But then Harold nodded slowly, as if making a decision. "You're a curious one, aren't you?" Harold said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "It's rare for people to ask about those days. Most just want to hear a good war story, not the truth." Ethan leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "I want the truth." Harold studied him for a long moment, then sighed, his eyes growing solemn. It wasn't a life of heroics, like people imagine. It was a life of choices. Some easy, some. He trailed off, as if weighing the memories. Some that haunt you. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in Harold's voice, an edge, a gravity, that spoke of things he'd rather forget. For the first time, Ethan saw beyond the calm, wise exterior. He saw a man who had seen and survived things most people couldn't comprehend. "What happened?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Harold took a deep breath, looking off into the distance. "I was in charge of a squad during the war. Good men. Men who trusted me." He paused, his face clouded with a sadness that seemed to reach down to his very soul. But trust isn't enough when you're faced with choices that no one should have to make. Ethan watched Harold, captivated and disturbed. What kind of choices? Harold met his gaze, his expression soft but unyielding. The kind that change you, the kind that stay with you long after the battles are over. Ethan swallowed, feeling the weight of Harold's words. He wanted to ask more, but something held him back, a respect for the things Harold seemed unwilling to share. They returned to the game, but the mood had shifted. Harold's moves were still careful, strategic, but there was a depth to them that Ethan hadn't noticed before. Each move seemed to carry an unspoken message, a lesson that Ethan was only beginning to understand. The game continued in silence, each move like a conversation between them, a silent exchange of thoughts and experiences. Ethan played differently this time, more thoughtfully, his mind still reeling from what he'd learned. As they reached the end of the game, with Harold once again on the verge of victory, Ethan couldn't hold back his questions any longer. "Why do you play like this, Harold?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet but insistent. "It's like you're trying to teach me something." Harold looked up, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Maybe I am. Or maybe you're finally learning what this game is really about." Ethan frowned, frustrated but intrigued. "What do you mean?" Harold leaned back, folding his hands. "Chess isn't just about winning or losing, Ethan. It's about understanding. Understanding your opponent, understanding yourself, and understanding the consequences of each move you make." Ethan felt a surge of frustration. "But what does that have to do with anything? It's just a game." Harold shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "Life is a game too. Every choice, every action, it all matters. The sooner you understand that, the better off you'll be." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but something in Harold's expression stopped him. He realized, with a jolt, that this wasn't just about chess. It was about something much bigger, something he was only beginning to grasp. As Harold packed up the board, he gave Ethan a final, thoughtful look. "Think on that, Ethan. We'll play again tomorrow." And with that, Harold stood and walked away, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and the weight of the unspoken lesson hanging between them. Ethan spent the night tossing and turning, replaying Harold's words in his mind. Life is a game. Every choice, every action, it all matters. It wasn't just the game that had left him unsettled. It was the way Harold had spoken, as if he were passing down some hidden wisdom that went beyond the simple strategy of chess. For the first time, Ethan was seeing chess not just as a battle of minds, but as a reflection of something bigger, something about himself. The next day, he returned to the square with a quiet determination, feeling strangely humbled. Harold was already there, sitting with his hands folded in his lap, as if waiting patiently. The board was set up, but this time there was a distinct energy in the air, an intensity that Ethan couldn't ignore. He took a seat and gave Harold a nod. "I'm ready." Harold smiled, something almost approving in his expression. "Good, let's begin." Ethan moved his pawn, but his usual aggressive style was gone. He played slowly, deliberately, each move carefully considered. Harold seemed to notice and responded with equal patience, the two of them settling into a rhythm that was less about competition and more about connection. There was a sense of respect between them now, a silent acknowledgement of the lessons being exchanged. They played in silence, the tension between them building with each move. But this time, Ethan felt something different, a sense of calm, a clarity he hadn't experienced before. He was learning to think ahead, to see the board not just as a path to victory, but as a series of choices, each with its own consequences. After a few quiet minutes, Harold spoke. "You've changed your approach," he observed. "Why?" Ethan hesitated, but then he met Harold's gaze, feeling the weight of the question. "I'm starting to understand what you meant, about the game, and about life, I guess." Harold's expression softened and he nodded approvingly. "That's the first step, Ethan. Understanding. But the real challenge is learning to live by it." Ethan frowned, feeling both frustrated and curious. "You talk like you've lived 100 lives, Harold, like you've seen things most people can't even imagine." Harold smiled, a bittersweet expression crossing his face. "Perhaps I have. But wisdom isn't about experience alone. It's about reflection, about learning from each moment, each choice. It's about seeing beyond yourself." Ethan leaned back, letting the words sink in. "So, chess is just your way of teaching that?" Harold shrugged. "For some, it's chess. For others, it's something else. But the lesson remains the same. Understand what's in front of you, and consider what lies beyond." They continued the game, but Ethan found himself lost in thought, his mind turning over Harold's words. He was beginning to see that Harold's calm demeanor wasn't just a result of age or experience, it was a choice to live with intention, to approach life with patience and humility. Finally, the game reached its conclusion, with Harold once again emerging as the victor. Ethan felt a pang of disappointment, but it was different this time, more reflective than frustrated. Harold leaned forward, his eyes serious. "You've come a long way, Ethan. But remember, wisdom isn't a destination. It's a journey." Ethan nodded slowly, feeling a sense of gratitude he couldn't quite put into words. "Thank you, Harold, for everything." Harold smiled, a warmth in his gaze that spoke of respect. "The pleasure's mine, Ethan. And remember, life is like this board. The more you understand it, the better you play." As Ethan stood to leave, he felt a newfound clarity, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. He walked away from the square with Harold's words echoing in his mind, knowing that this was just the beginning of a journey he hadn't anticipated. And, for the first time, he felt ready to face it. Ethan's routine changed after those games with Harold. He found himself viewing the world with a newfound awareness, questioning his motives, his actions, and even his goals. But, despite the lessons he was learning, one question lingered in his mind. Who was Harold, really? He sensed that there was so much more beneath Harold's calm exterior, stories of a life that went far beyond simple wisdom. The next time Ethan arrived at the square, he found Harold already there, as always, but today he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a tall, rugged man in a police uniform, his posture as rigid and disciplined as Harold's own. Harold looked up, smiling when he saw Ethan approach. "Ethan," he said, gesturing to the man beside him, "I'd like you to meet Officer Rick Archer. Rick and I go way back." Rick extended a hand, his eyes keen as he looked Ethan up and down. "So, you're the young man Harold's been telling me about," he said with a slight smile. "He says you're finally learning a few things." Ethan shook his hand, surprised. "I didn't know Harold shared much about himself," he said, glancing over at Harold, who was watching them both with that familiar, knowing smile. Rick chuckled. "Harold doesn't share much with most people, but he and we have history. A lot of history." The words hung in the air, and Ethan felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if he were on the edge of uncovering a mystery he'd been piecing together since their first game. "Harold told me a bit about his time in the military," Ethan said cautiously, "but I get the sense there's more to it." Harold looked at Rick, and after a brief moment of silence, he nodded. "I think it's time, Rick." Rick took a deep breath, then looked back at Ethan. "Harold isn't just a veteran, Ethan. He was one of the most respected leaders I ever served under. He saved lives, made decisions no one else could, and he paid a price for it." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Harold had hinted at things before, but hearing it from someone else brought a new gravity to his understanding. Rick continued, his voice softening. "I was part of his squad. He was the one we looked up to, the one who led us through some of the darkest days of our lives. When others doubted, Harold believed. He taught us to think ahead, to act with purpose, to treat each choice like it mattered. Those lessons saved us more times than I can count." Ethan glanced at Harold, who was looking away, his face unreadable. He wanted to ask more, to know everything, but something held him back, a respect for the memories Harold seemed to hold so close. "I don't understand," Ethan said finally, looking back at Rick. "Why doesn't he tell people? Why keep it a secret?" Rick smiled sadly. "Because Harold isn't looking for recognition. He's looking to pass on what he learned, to help others understand without needing the whole story." Harold finally looked up, meeting Ethan's gaze with a quiet intensity. "Some stories don't need to be told in words," he said softly. "Sometimes it's enough to let the lessons speak for themselves." Ethan swallowed, realizing the weight of Harold's wisdom in a way he hadn't before. The man across from him wasn't just a skilled chess player or a quiet observer of life. He was someone who had faced the unimaginable and come out the other side, carrying a wisdom he now offered freely to those willing to learn. They sat down to play, but the energy between them was different now. Ethan felt as if he were truly seeing Harold for the first time, not as an opponent, but as a mentor, a guide. The game unfolded with the same quiet intensity, but this time Ethan was no longer focused on winning. He was focused on learning, on understanding the depth of each move, each choice. As the game drew to a close, Harold looked up, his gaze steady. "Remember, Ethan, life is like this board. Every move counts. Every choice has meaning. It's up to you to decide what kind of player you'll be." Ethan nodded, the weight of Harold's words settling within him. He had come to this square seeking victory, but he was leaving with something far greater, a sense of purpose, a guide for the road ahead. As he stood to leave, Harold reached out, stopping him. "One last thing, Ethan," he said, his voice soft but firm. "The journey isn't easy. But remember, you're never alone. There's always someone willing to help if you look in the right places." Ethan nodded, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you, Harold, for everything." Harold smiled, watching him walk away, a quiet pride in his gaze. And as Ethan left, he felt the weight of a life's worth of wisdom at his back, guiding him forward into a world he was finally beginning to understand. The following days passed with a new clarity in Ethan's mind. Harold's lessons had become a part of him, reshaping how he viewed the world. But there was still something he didn't understand. Harold had hinted at a past full of difficult choices and sacrifices, and Rick's visit had only deepened Ethan's curiosity. The older man's calm, his patience, these things seemed to come from something deeper, a place Ethan had yet to reach. One afternoon, as he returned to the square, Ethan found Harold waiting for him, setting up the board as usual. But today, Harold's expression was different, quieter, more reflective. "Ready for another game?" Harold asked, gesturing to the board. Ethan nodded, though today the game felt like an afterthought. His mind was still filled with questions, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold them back. As they played, Ethan noticed Harold's attention seemed elsewhere, his focus softened, almost as if he were seeing something beyond the board. "Harold," Ethan said slowly, breaking the silence, "what's on your mind?" Harold looked up, and for a brief moment his gaze softened. He studied Ethan with a look that seemed to measure not only Ethan's understanding, but his readiness. "There's something I haven't told you," Harold said quietly. "Something I think you're ready to hear." Ethan leaned in, his curiosity piqued. He waited, sensing the weight of the words Harold was about to share. "I didn't come back from the war as the same man I was when I left," Harold began, his voice steady but filled with a quiet sorrow. "The choices I made, the lives I was responsible for, they changed me. Some of those choices saved lives, but some took a piece of me that I could never get back." Ethan felt a chill run through him, a new understanding dawning. "Is that why you come here? Why you teach people like me?" Harold nodded slowly. "I come here because I want to pass on what I've learned. I want people to understand that life isn't about winning at all costs. Sometimes it's about knowing when to step back, when to let go." They continued in silence, the weight of Harold's words hanging between them. Ethan looked down at the board, seeing the pieces in a new light, each one representing a choice, a consequence. "Harold, how do you make peace with it?" Ethan asked softly. "With the choices you had to make?" Harold's face grew solemn, and he placed a hand on the edge of the table, as if steadying himself. "You don't," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not completely, but you find a way to live with it, to make something good from it, and maybe, just maybe, you pass that understanding on to someone else." The answer resonated within Ethan, filling him with a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt before. Harold had seen and done things that most people couldn't understand, yet he had chosen to give back, to teach those who crossed his path. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the impact of Harold's words settle in his mind. He realized now that Harold's lessons weren't about chess or strategy. They were about life, about how to carry on even when the weight of the world bore down on you. As the game reached its end, Harold looked up, his expression calm but serious. "Ethan, there's one last thing I want you to remember." Ethan met his gaze, sensing the importance of what Harold was about to say. "When you face challenges, remember this. Strength isn't about overpowering others. It's about standing firm in your choices and living with the consequences. It's about having the courage to do what's right, even when it's the hardest thing you'll ever do." Ethan nodded, the gravity of Harold's words filling him with a newfound determination. He stood to leave, feeling both humbled and inspired, his path forward illuminated by the quiet strength of the man who had taught him more than he ever thought possible. "Thank you, Harold," he said quietly, "for everything." Harold gave him a small nod, a quiet pride shining in his eyes. "Take care, Ethan. Remember what you've learned." As Ethan walked away from the square, he felt a sense of purpose settle within him. He didn't know where his journey would lead, but he knew that, thanks to Harold, he was finally ready to face whatever lay ahead. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan found himself replaying Harold's lessons over and over in his mind. The veteran's words had unlocked something profound within him, and he could sense the changes in his own outlook. He no longer saw life as a series of battles to be won. Instead, he was beginning to understand the subtleties of patience, humility, and self-reflection. But one question lingered in his mind. Had he truly learned everything Harold wanted him to know? One evening, after a particularly long day, Ethan felt an urge to visit the square, to see Harold, and maybe even play one more game. He arrived just before sunset, the golden light casting long shadows over the empty chess tables. Harold wasn't there. He waited, pacing around the square, glancing at the path Harold usually took. Minutes passed, and an odd sense of unease settled over him. Harold was never late, and in all the time Ethan had known him, the man had never missed a game. Just as Ethan was about to give up, he saw Officer Rick Archer approaching from across the square. "Looking for Harold?" Rick asked, a knowing but sad smile on his face. Ethan nodded, frowning. "Is everything all right?" Rick let out a long breath, glancing at the chessboard. "Harold's in the hospital. He's not well." Ethan felt a jolt of shock. "The hospital? What happened?" Rick hesitated, his face clouded. "He's been sick for a while now, but he didn't want anyone to know. Didn't want to worry people or burden them with his troubles." Ethan's mind raced, and a pang of guilt tugged at him. How had he missed the signs? How had he been so focused on his own learning that he hadn't noticed Harold's quiet struggle? He turned to Rick, his voice barely a whisper. "Can I see him?" Rick nodded, resting a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I think he'd like that." Ethan arrived at the hospital later that evening, his heart pounding as he made his way down the sterile, quiet hallway. He found Harold's room and hesitated at the door, gathering his thoughts. After a deep breath, he stepped inside. Harold lay in the bed, pale but peaceful, his eyes closed as if he were simply resting. When he sensed Ethan's presence, he opened his eyes, a gentle smile crossing his face. "Ethan," he said softly, his voice weaker but still carrying that familiar warmth. "Didn't expect to see you here." Ethan pulled up a chair, his throat tight. "I had to come. I couldn't not be here." Harold chuckled, though the sound was faint. "You always were a curious one." They sat in silence for a moment, and Ethan searched for the right words. "Rick told me you've been dealing with this for a while. Why didn't you say anything?" Harold's gaze softened and he shrugged. "I didn't want pity, Ethan. I've lived a full life, a life of choices, of victories and losses. This is just another chapter." Ethan struggled to hold back his emotions, feeling the gravity of the moment. "You taught me so much, Harold. I don't know if I ever told you, but you changed the way I see everything." Harold's smile grew, his eyes shining with a quiet pride. "That's all I ever wanted, Ethan. To pass on what I've learned. To make sure someone else was ready to take on the world with open eyes." Ethan reached out, placing a hand over Harold's. "I don't think I could ever thank you enough. You've taught me things I didn't even know I needed to learn." Harold's hand, though frail, gave a reassuring squeeze. "It was always there in you, Ethan. I just helped you see it." The room grew quiet, and after a long pause, Harold took a deep, steadying breath. "There's one last thing I want you to remember, Ethan." Ethan leaned in, holding on to each word. "What's that?" Harold's voice was a whisper, yet each word was clear and steady. "Live your life with purpose. Don't let fear or doubt keep you from making the choices that matter. Life isn't about waiting for the right moment. It's about making every moment count." Ethan nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him, filling the emptiness that had lingered in his heart. "I will, Harold. I promise." Harold gave a final nod, closing his eyes with a peaceful smile. "Then my work here is done." Ethan sat by Harold's side, watching over him as the night settled in, a quiet strength blooming within him. Harold had left him with everything he needed, not just for a game of chess, but for the game of life. And as he walked out of the hospital that night, Ethan knew that he carried Harold's lessons with him, ready to live a life that honored the man who had shown him the way. The days following Harold's passing felt heavy, and yet Ethan felt an unmistakable sense of peace. He returned to the square each afternoon, carrying Harold's chessboard with him, setting it up as Harold had always done. At first, he sat alone, thinking over each lesson, each moment he'd shared with Harold. It was a way of keeping him close, of honoring the quiet wisdom the man had passed on. People began to notice. The regulars who had once watched Harold play noticed the young man now sitting in his place, his gaze as thoughtful and steady as Harold's had been. A few curious passers-by stopped to play with him, and Ethan found himself repeating the advice Harold had once shared with him. His words held a new weight, carrying on Harold's legacy. One afternoon, while Ethan was lost in a game with a young boy eager to learn, Officer Rick Archer approached the table, smiling softly as he watched. "You're doing a good job, Ethan," he said once the boy had left, glancing at the chessboard. Ethan looked up, surprised but grateful. "I'm trying. Harold taught me more than I realized at first. Now, it's like I see the world through his eyes." Rick nodded, taking a seat across from him. That was Harold's gift. He didn't just teach people how to play, he taught them how to see. Rick paused, his gaze thoughtful. "He'd be proud of you, you know," carrying on what he started. Ethan shifted, feeling the weight of those words. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm even doing it right. I don't have his experience, his depth." Rick chuckled. "Depth isn't about experience alone, Ethan. Harold saw something in you. He wouldn't have shared his wisdom with you if he didn't think you had it in you." The two men played in silence for a while, each move a quiet homage to Harold's memory. As the game drew to an end, Rick leaned back, his expression serious. "Harold once told me that life is like a chessboard," Rick said. "Every choice we make, every step we take, it's all part of a greater strategy. He believed that if you moved with purpose, you'd eventually see the pattern emerge." Ethan nodded, remembering the countless times Harold had reminded him of the same thing. "He taught me that life isn't just about winning. It's about understanding each move and about finding meaning in the choices we make." Rick's gaze softened. "You understand more than you think, Ethan. Just keep going. Don't let the lessons he taught you fade. Pass them on." Ethan smiled, feeling Harold's presence in every word, every move, every quiet moment. The legacy Harold had left wasn't just in the lessons or in the games. It was in the lives he had touched, in the wisdom he had passed down, and in the purpose he had instilled. As Rick left, Ethan sat back, watching the sun set over the square, casting long shadows over the chessboard. He knew that life, like the board in front of him, was full of choices, each one leading to something new, something unexpected. And with every move he made, he felt Harold guiding him, reminding him to play with patience, humility, and courage. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling ready to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that Harold's lessons were now a part of him. He'd carry them forward, passing them on just as Harold had, keeping the torch burning brightly in honor of the man who had changed his life forever. Over the next few months, Ethan continued his ritual, showing up at the square each day with Harold's chessboard. People of all ages came to play with him, children curious about the game, adults hoping to rekindle a lost love for chess, and a few regulars who had known Harold and now found comfort in Ethan's presence. As Ethan played, he found himself repeating Harold's lessons, his voice echoing the same calm, measured wisdom that Harold had once shared with him. One crisp autumn afternoon, a young girl approached, her face filled with a mixture of excitement and shyness. She couldn't have been more than 12, her eyes bright with curiosity as she looked at the chess pieces spread across the board. "Do you want to play?" Ethan asked, smiling gently. The girl nodded eagerly, taking the seat across from him. As they started the game, she fumbled with her moves, uncertain and nervous. But Ethan patiently guided her, showing her the basics while weaving in lessons Harold had taught him. "You don't have to rush," he said, noticing how quickly she moved her pieces. "Sometimes the best move is the one you don't see right away." She tilted her head, studying the board, a thoughtful look crossing her face. "I never thought of it that way." Ethan chuckled. "Neither did I at first, but I had a good teacher." As they played, Ethan felt Harold's presence beside him, as if the older man were watching and guiding him, proud of the way Ethan was sharing his wisdom. For the first time, he understood what it meant to give something of yourself to others, to pass on the knowledge and the understanding that Harold had gifted him. The game with the girl stretched on, her confidence growing as she absorbed the advice Ethan shared. When the game ended, she looked up at him with a wide smile. "Can I come back and play with you again?" Ethan nodded, warmth filling his heart. "Any time you want." The girl skipped off, clutching the small notebook in which she'd jotted down tips Ethan had given her, her eyes bright with excitement. Watching her go, Ethan felt a powerful sense of purpose, as though he were exactly where he was meant to be. As word spread, more people came to the square, drawn by the stories of Harold's young protégé, the man who shared wisdom over the chessboard just as Harold had. Ethan became a fixture in the town, known for his calm guidance and patience, a living embodiment of Harold's legacy. He taught not only the game, but the lessons that went beyond it, about patience, courage, and the importance of every choice. One day, as Ethan was packing up, a familiar face approached. Officer Rick Archer. Rick had stopped by often over the past few months, but today his expression was one of deep appreciation. "Ethan," Rick said, shaking his hand, "you've turned this square into something special. Harold would be proud." Ethan looked down, feeling the weight of Rick's words. "I hope so. I just want to keep his spirit alive, you know? To make sure that what he taught me doesn't end with me." Rick smiled. "And you're doing that, more than you know. You've become what Harold was to this town, a quiet, guiding force." Ethan felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't expected, as though he had truly grown into the person Harold had seen in him all along. "Thank you, Rick. I couldn't have done this without him, and maybe I needed it just as much as anyone else." Rick nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "We all did. Harold left us a piece of himself, and now you're carrying that forward." As Rick walked away, Ethan looked around the square, seeing it with new eyes. It was no longer just a place where he'd learned the game of chess. It was a place where he'd discovered himself, where he'd been given the tools to live with purpose, strength, and compassion. Years passed, and the square continued to be a place of quiet transformation. Ethan, now older and wiser, continued to teach, to share, to pass on the lessons he had learned. Harold's chessboard, worn and polished from years of use, became a symbol of the quiet power of one person's influence, a testament to the enduring strength of wisdom shared with kindness. On a warm spring day, a young man approached the square, glancing nervously at Ethan, who now held the familiar seat that had once belonged to Harold. The young man took a seat across from him, eyes darting from the board to Ethan's face, curiosity written all over him. "Do you play often?" the young man asked, clearly trying to hide his nerves. Ethan smiled, echoing Harold's familiar words. "Enough," he replied, setting up the pieces. "But if you're looking for a quick win, you may need to reconsider." The young man laughed, his confidence growing as he took his first move, and so, with the same patience, wisdom, and humility that Harold had shown him, Ethan guided the young man through his first game, sharing insights that went far beyond chess. As they played, Ethan felt Harold's presence beside him, watching over his shoulder with pride, and in that moment Ethan knew that Harold's legacy would live on, not just in him, but in every person who came to the square seeking more than a game. It was a legacy of understanding, of purpose, and of choices made with an open heart. Ethan knew he would be there, as Harold had been, ready to teach, to guide, and to pass on the lessons that had changed his life forever. Years went by, and Ethan became a constant figure in the town square, known for his quiet wisdom and patient presence. Generations of locals and travelers alike sat across from him at the chessboard, each seeking something they couldn't quite name. Ethan offered them more than a game. He offered the kind of guidance that reached beyond the chess pieces, the same wisdom Harold had once shared with him. On a peaceful autumn afternoon, Ethan arrived at the square and noticed a young boy, maybe 10 years old, standing by the chessboard, his eyes wide with wonder. "Are you here for a game?" Ethan asked, smiling as he sat down and began arranging the pieces. The boy nodded eagerly, taking his seat and leaning forward with youthful excitement. They began to play, and Ethan shared the lessons he had spent a lifetime learning: patience, humility, courage in the face of challenge, and the importance of every choice. As the game progressed, the boy looked up, curiosity shining in his eyes. "Who taught you to play like this?" Ethan smiled, a warmth blooming within him as he thought of Harold. "An old friend," he said softly. "He taught me to see the game and life in a way I never could before. He showed me that winning isn't the goal. The goal is to understand." The boy nodded thoughtfully, moving his knight and smiling proudly when Ethan leaned back, impressed. As they finished the game, the boy's mother arrived, smiling and thanking Ethan as she took her son's hand. As they walked away, Ethan gazed at the empty chessboard, a quiet peace settling over him. He'd done exactly what Harold had hoped he would. He had carried on the lessons, passing down wisdom and hope to those who came seeking it, whether they realized it or not. In the fading light, Ethan sat back, a contented smile on his face, watching the leaves swirl around the square. He could feel Harold's presence beside him, as strong as ever, the unspoken bond between them alive and unwavering. He picked up a pawn and set it on the board, the last move of the day, and whispered, "Thank you, Harold, for everything." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan knew that Harold's legacy would live on, woven into the lives he'd touched and the lessons he'd passed down, just as Harold had passed them to him. Ethan had come a long way from the confident young man who'd once challenged Harold in the square. What began as a simple game of chess had evolved into a journey of self-discovery, purpose, and connection. Through Harold's quiet wisdom, Ethan had learned the true meaning of strength and patience, not as a display of power, but as a path of understanding and humility. Years later, Ethan remained in the square, sitting at the same chessboard, sharing the same timeless lessons Harold had passed to him. He watched new players come and go, guiding them with the same calm presence, teaching them to see beyond the pieces, to understand the meaning in every choice. In the small, everyday interactions, Ethan realized Harold's legacy lived on, shaping lives in ways that went deeper than words or wins. Ethan had found purpose in the act of teaching, in the simple yet profound task of listening and guiding. Harold's lessons had come full circle, leaving an indelible mark on both Ethan's life and the lives of those he encountered. And with every game played, every lesson shared, Ethan felt Harold's presence, as strong and steady as ever, a quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful legacies are those we pass on quietly, through understanding, compassion, and choice. As the sun set each evening, Ethan would pack up the board, look around the now familiar square, and feel an overwhelming sense of peace. Harold's wisdom had not only transformed his life, it had given him the tools to help others transform theirs. And in that, he knew, Harold's spirit would live on. If you found something meaningful in this story, a lesson or a moment that resonated, consider sharing it with someone who could use a bit of quiet wisdom in their life. Harold's legacy shows us that sometimes the greatest impact comes from small acts, thoughtful choices, and the willingness to guide others. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more inspiring tales, hit the subscribe button and join us on this journey of stories that touch the heart and mind. Remember, every like, share, and comment helps us reach more people with messages of resilience, courage, and kindness. Thank you for being a part of this story with us.